All right, so I've gotten straight A pluses for 3.5 years now in my studies in engineering. And I've done this while still training hard in the gym and spending time with my friends. So a big reason for why I've been able to do this, to balance these aspects of my life while I'm studying, is because early on in my university experience, I learned how to really effectively study, how to efficiently spend my time when I'm studying. So in this video, we're going to discuss how you can also learn to study more effectively so you're not wasting your time on work that really doesn't produce much results. And so when you're not doing that, when you're not wasting your time on work that doesn't produce results, you have more time to spend how you want, to do more studying or to, hang out with your friends, go to the gym, do any other thing that you would like to. So let's get into that. We're going to talk about three different things, three different insights that you can take that hopefully you can implement them so that you can study more effectively. So the first insight I have to study more effectively is to actually just study the right material, okay? Because as a student, you need to understand that just because you're working all the time, just because you're studying all the time, doesn't mean you're going to, get the results that you want, all right? There's probably students who study significantly less than you, maybe who even have the same, background for knowledge and for information, yet they will perform better on the test. And so, yeah, there's other things that you might not be able to control that contribute to this, but one thing that you can control is the material that you study, okay? Because some material will give you better results than other material. So understand that, certain material has a higher ROI. And I know this is a really simple concept, but understanding this, that certain material has a higher ROI, is a very important thing to understand, okay? Because it's not just the number of hours that you put in that is going to, dictate the output, which is, your grade, okay? It's not just the hours, it's what you're putting those hours into, okay? You can put 10 hours of studying, reading the textbook, reading your professor's notes, going through the slides, adjusting your notes, highlighting them, making them look all pretty, okay? You can spend as much time as you want doing that, okay? But the ROI, the return on investment, isn't there, okay? Because you can spend significantly less time. You can spend 4 hours doing assignments, practice tests, okay? Maybe some textbook problems. And those 4 hours will obviously give you a greater result than the 10 hours, okay? Great, because this 4 hours here is spent on the effective studying. You're doing material that has a higher ROI, right? So, if you take that high ROI material, you can get that work done in 4 hours, or you can take some low ROI material, and that'll take you 10 hours to get a worse result. And so you really just need to be aware of what work you're doing, okay? Because this is where the 80-20 rule comes in, all right? There is a rule, okay, and it's called the 80-20 rule. And it is that the work you do, the input isn't correlative to the output, okay? So there's 20% of work you can do in something, all right, that will produce 80% of the result. So doing a few small tasks, a few important tasks, will get you most of your result in anything, right? But there's also, 80% of the work. The other 80% of the work, only produces the other 20% of the result. So here's the thing. Let's say you're a student, okay? And you don't really know, what is the important work to do. So without knowing it, you put in hours and hours and hours. You've put in a whole lot of work. You put in, 80% of the total workload, okay? Possible, all right? And that produced, unfortunately, not much results, 20% of the results. Another student, okay, puts in 4 times less hours, okay? He only does 20% of the work, okay? So that's 4 times less than the 80% student, okay? And he gets 80% of the result. So here's the thing, right? Let's call this, the top student. We think that they must be studying hours, or they're just inherently smarter than everybody, but maybe, they're just doing the right work, okay? They're just doing the 20% of work that produces 80% of the result, which means that, they get to do 4 times less work and they get 4 times greater result than the student who, does this, who does the 80% of the work for only 20% of the result. And I hope you can just understand the importance, the magnitude of this, because by implementing that 80-20 rule, by finding what 20% of work produces 80% of the result, and by avoiding what 80% of work produces 20% of the result, we can 4 times less the amount of input we got to put in for 4 times the greater output. So we do 4 times less studying than the student who picks the wrong work to do, and we get 4x the result, right? So of course there's other aspects to why students do well and stuff, but we got to focus on the inputs we can change, which in this case is what work we're doing. Are we choosing, to be the top student who knows what work to do? Are we choosing to be the poor student who, does all the wrong work, They put in 4 times the amount of hours and they just didn't do very well because they put the wrong hours in. They put in the hours that produce less result. So that's something to very much be aware of, okay? Because you can put in so much effort, so much time, and if it's in the wrong work, the wrong material, the result's not going to be there. So what is that 20% that's going to produce the most result? Well, I've talked about it before, but practice exams, previous papers, all right, these are your number one resource for, improving your understanding before a test. Number one resource by far. Otherwise, you have assignments, previous quizzes, tutorials, or things that your professor's gone through in class, textbook problems, okay? You'll notice that all of this is practice, okay? None of this is passive review that many students, get caught up on. I'm going to check out my notes. I'm going to look at the lecture slides. That's all fine. Sometimes it's important to, go and get some quick understanding from the slides, but practice, that's the key here. And if you're not in a technical class, like physics, engineering, math, chemistry to an extent, then there's other things that might be the, highest ROI task for you, okay? So, maybe you're a bio student, and then things like flashcards, well, that's a high ROI activity. That repetition, that practice, that's what's going to give you that understanding, that memorization that's going to help you do better in your classes. So whatever it is, okay, based on each class, that might vary a little bit, but you need to be focusing on these high ROI activities. And to recognize these habits that actually produce the high ROI, you need to be looking at, where am I actually practicing something? When is my mind actually going through mental effort, right? Because to learn, you need to have mental effort. Mental effort is required, okay, for learning. And so any activity that doesn't have mental effort, any, sort of studying that doesn't really take much mental effort, means that the learning gets cut out from the source, okay? So if there's no mental effort, you don't get any learning, all right? And so what does that look like? Well, like we were talking about earlier, does rewriting your notes, just highlighting your notes, making them pretty, really, take much mental effort? No, okay, it doesn't. So learning is just not there, all right? Does reading lecture slides take much mental effort? Not really. So learning is not there. Now, does doing a practice exam, does doing practice problems take mental effort? Well, yeah, you need to be focused. You need to be looking at that. Maybe you'll refer to the lecture slides during it, okay? But to actually do the problems, you need to be focused and not distracted. That takes mental effort, okay? And when there's that mental effort, that means that learning happens, okay? And this is really what efficient studying is, because when you're increasing your mental effort, right? When your mental effort goes up, your learning goes up. And what happens when your learning goes up? Increased learning means less time required, all right? Because you're getting better learning done, so you don't require as much time. So generally, just be looking for things, where can we maximize that mental effort? Because that's what's going to be the most effective studying that there is. And of course, just because the effort is high doesn't mean it's always going to lead to the most learning, right? But it's still a good sign to look out for. So for example, right, you're in the library, you're studying with friends, you're working on your assignment, okay? You're distracted all the time. You're not really putting in much mental effort. You're talking, you're having this conversation, then you get back to your work, you're trying to, solve the assignment again, then you get distracted, and then maybe you get back to your work. And so in this situation, right, you're not high focus, you're not high mental effort. And so as a result, you don't learn as much, you're not doing the assignment as well. And of course, because you're not learning as much, because you're not producing as much effective work, because you're not putting in that mental effort, you have to spend more time actually doing that assignment. So generally, increase your mental effort to increase your learning, to decrease the amount of time required to complete the task or just to actually learn the material, right? So that's the first insight I have to actually studying more effectively. It's study the right material. Find that 20% that produces that large result, because that's what's going to, have that high ROI, all right? And once you have that high ROI, well, that means that, less time is actually required to produce that same result. So if you want to study more effectively, study the right material. So the next tip I have for studying more effectively is actually just being deliberate. Now, what does that mean? What does being deliberate mean? Well, I'm going to ask you a question, okay? Think about the last time you've sat down, for a long period of time to actually, study. Maybe you had a test coming up, or maybe you're just like, okay, I'm going to lock in today. I'm going to get done like 4 hours of work. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to work. How much work did you actually produce? Okay? What was the output of that long, that heavy input session? Okay? Because I can almost guarantee that when you're studying for these long hours, when you're like, oh, I'm going to do this 6-hour study session, you are not accomplishing 6 hours of work. Very rarely. That's such a difficult thing to actually do. To produce 6 hours of quality work in 6 hours, that is like unheard of, okay? So I want to ask you, are you actually producing 3 hours of work in 3 hours? Are you actually producing 6 hours of work in 6 hours? Chances are you're probably not, all right? Maybe after 30 minutes, you get distracted, you check your phone, okay? But it wasn't just like the time you spent checking your phone that takes away from those 3 hours. It's also that it takes significant time. It takes 15 minutes to get back on track, to get back into the deep work state that you were in after you get distracted by something, like checking your phone. But it might not just be that, right? You might not just be distracted by phone or by people or other things, right? Maybe you get stuck on some part of the work you're doing. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to put that to the side. And then you switch tasks. Okay. Now you're answering emails, or now you're doing an easier assignment or an easier part of your homework. All right. And so every time you switch tasks like this, you're also decreasing the efficiency of your work. Or if you're studying with friends, anytime somebody says anything, all right, a little bit of your mind, even if you're not listening to them, a little bit of your mind is getting taken away from the work in front of you, and it's going towards them, okay? And so all of these, people around you, distractions, switching tasks, even switching to other productive tasks, all of this is decreasing your work efficiency. And so I can almost guarantee, if you are sitting with friends, okay, and every once in a while, people say something and you check your phone 2 or 3 times during a 3-hour work block and you switch tasks 2 or 3 times, you probably got less than an hour of actual work done, okay? Less than an hour. And so why did you sit down to work in the first place for 3 hours if you were only going to get 1 hour of work done? One of the things that I really just don't like to see is that often in the library, in the evenings, I see people just sitting there, long hours. They look tired, they look fatigued. But the one thing is, they're always in groups. It's never alone, okay? Because when you're in a group studying with people, naturally the work is just not going to be as effective, as efficient, right? Because there's always that little distraction. There's always that conversation that comes up. There's always that person that comes by to talk. They got to show you something on their phone. And all of a sudden you've been sitting at a desk for 6 hours, all right? And you've produced less than an hour of work, all right? I know people like to sit down and study with friends, but think of the trade-offs, all right? Is long, unproductive hours where you get minimal output worth the few decent conversations you have with friends during that period of time? Or would you rather, say, hey guys, I don't get much work done. We all know that we don't get much work done when we sit at this table together. Let's go our separate ways. Let's study for an hour. And then we have 5 hours to do whatever we want with each other after, okay? Like, think of the trade-offs, right? In one situation, you get a few poor, mediocre, decent conversations and 1 hour of output. Or in the other situation, you get 1 hour of quality output, and then you have 5 hours to spend socially with your friends or however you'd like after, right? So you really got to consider, am I actually producing output, worth the input that I'm putting in, okay? Because for most people, it's not. For most people, the phone distracts you every once in a while. People distract you every once in a while. You switch tasks every once in a while, and all of a sudden, your work session that was 3 hours was effectively 1 or less, okay? So be wary of this, okay? You got to be deliberate when you're sitting down to actually work. That's the whole point of this chapter, is to be deliberate, right? The faster that you understand that work time is time to work is the faster that the work actually gets done. And the faster you got to go do whatever else you want to do with your friends after. And you also get the advantage of producing better work in that time because you're more focused. So be deliberate, all right? If you mix work time with socializing time or, other time, or you're going to have a YouTube video on while you're studying, all of this is nice in theory. Oh, I'm going to multitask. I'm going to do it. Humans suck at multitasking. Have you ever tried to talk to somebody while they're having a conversation, texting someone else? You just can't, because the focus is split between multiple things. So every time you split your focus while you're studying, every time you have a YouTube video on beside you, or you check your phone every once in a while, or you talk to your friends, it's just making your work longer, all right? You're actively choosing to sit down at this desk, at this computer, doing work that most of the time you might not even want to do for longer. So if there's one thing that I would say that's going to help you, is just, be deliberate, okay? Work time is work time. Just let it be that, okay? The faster you understand that, the faster you can get out and go do other things that you want to do with people you want to spend time with, okay? So, be deliberate. What is deliberate? It means work is work, okay? It's not time to, let your mind do other things. It's you sitting down and saying, hey, this is a time to work. I'm being deliberate. I'm being intentional with my time. I'm going to sit down for this period of time and I'm going to produce some good work. That's being deliberate. Okay. You're being intentional. You're setting, this is work time. So that's the second insight to take that should help you improve your studying, improve your, effectiveness, is to be intentional, right? You're sitting down. The goal is to work. So this is the time to work. All right. So with that, I've told you, you need to study the right material, and you need to actually study. You need to be deliberate. How do we actually implement this now, right? Because it's good in theory, but it's not always easy to just sit down and be deliberate with your studying. Sometimes things happen. Sometimes you get distracted. And I could tell you, control your environment, put your phone away, don't study with friends. And I have plenty of videos on that. But I think the best way to implement it isn't actually, to actually actively choose to implement it, to actively, put your phone away, to actively sit down alone to study. It's all good. And these are things that you should do. But I think you can implement one thing instead that will make you naturally just study the right material and make you naturally not get distracted and be deliberate with your studies, right? And that is actually, to limit your studying, okay? And this is interesting, right? Because I'm saying, how do you study more effectively? Well, I'm saying put a limit on your studying. And I'm talking like a hard limit, all right? Tell yourself, okay, my books, my homework, my assignments, they can only be open for this class for 2 hours a week. Okay, let's call it that, right? 2 hours a week. You are putting this limit on yourself. And now, okay, now that you've put this 2 hours a week studying limit on yourself, watch what happens, okay? You have essentially forced yourself. You said, okay, I'm not allowed to work on this any other time. All right, I'm only allowed to work on this in this 2 hour block, or maybe, 1 hour block here, 1 hour block here. What happens now? Now, you will automatically, naturally study the right material. Assuming you know what that right material is, right? If you're given like 1 hour to study for a test, you better be automatically going to grab a practice test and doing it, right? Because you know in your heart, like you know deep down, reading that textbook, you could read that for 2 hours. That's not going to help you perform any better on the test. Or reading your notes, it's not really going to be the thing that changes things. You need to actively learn it, actively practice it. And so, given 2 hours, you're going to sit down and you're going to do the right work. And also, okay, given a 2 hour limit, if you have 2 hours, only 2 hours to study for a test, and you're literally not allowed to touch the material any other time this week, okay, how are you going to spend those 2 hours? You are not going to study it with friends. You will most certainly, put your phone away because you do not want to be distracted during this time, right? You probably won't be studying in a distracted environment. You're just going to sit down and you're going to work for 2 hours. So obviously this isn't always realistic. Sometimes an assignment itself might take 2 or 3 hours, but I just wanted to use this as an example, all right? Let's say you were only limited to 2 hours a week or 1 hour a week. You would sit down in that limited period of time and you would probably naturally make all the right decisions to get the work done in the period of time that is required, right? You wouldn't study with your phone. You wouldn't study with friends. You wouldn't, be distracted on YouTube or something. And you would definitely sit down and you would just be picking up, the right material to study, okay? So I just want to use that as an example, right? If your time was limited, you would find the ways to study effectively. So whether or not you implement this and how much hours you put on your limit, I don't know. I haven't actually personally implemented this, but it's something that I'm going to test out in my next semester. But I still want you to understand that theory behind it because, if you put yourself in that limit, if you place this limit upon yourself, you're going to be making these right decisions and you're going to be studying more effectively. So have that understanding. And, maybe, semester starts, you place that limit upon yourself. Say, hey, I'm going to try this out for a week. I'm only going to do 2 hours a week per class, okay? And so you can literally have a tracker, a notepad or whatever it is, 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours for each class, okay? And so this is your limit, right? So now if people sit down and say, hey, you want to come join us for a study session? Your answer is probably no, right? Because that's not going to be effective studying. But the next opportunity you have to sit down and get some good quality work done alone, you're going to take that, you're going to put those 2 hours in, you're going to check that box off, 2 hours, that class is done, all right? And then you just go through it with all your other classes throughout the week. And maybe 2 hours is not enough for you, maybe it is, but no matter what, I know you understand that having that limit there would be something that would, no matter what, increase the effectiveness, increase the efficiency of your studying. And as an extra enforcer to help you stick to that limit even better, make sure you're scheduling things throughout the week. Don't have hours and hours and hours of unplanned open time, right? Because if you have unplanned open time, you're going to sit down and you're going to do half productive work anyways, right? But that wasn't the point. We want to be spending our time efficiently and effectively. So instead, schedule things, right? If you're going to have a work block in the morning, all right, schedule something at 12 p.m. Go for a workout with your friends. Go, hang out with some people, all right? Because then you have no option but to get that work done in the morning. If you provide yourself with some external reward, okay, or external time constraint that forces you to get the work done during that period of time, it can work even better. Because I know if you say, I'm only going to let myself work 2 hours today, but you have nothing else planned the rest of the day, if your whole day is open, that 2 hours might bleed into 3, and then all of a sudden you're doing semi-productive work for 4, and then you go and take a break, you have lunch, and then you didn't really finish your work from earlier because you didn't actually have a time constraint. So you come back to work and you get more work done, and you just don't get that 2 hours of quality work done because you didn't have an external time constraint forcing you to get the work done during that period of time. So if you find yourself struggling with sticking to that 2 hour limit, just have other stuff scheduled, okay? If you have other things scheduled after, you are forcing yourself. You provide a external time constraint which will force yourself to get that work done during that period of time. So that's that, and that kind of links to my next point about, limiting your studying, and that's that you might say, what do I do with all this extra time, all right? I've limited my studying, I'm only doing this 3 hours a week, and to that I would say, just take this time, live your life, okay? Go outside, go to the gym, see some friends. These things are all things that will energize you. They'll all boost your mood, they'll boost your mental, and then you can take that energy, that mental, that mood, bring that into your studies, into that next 2 hour work block, right? Because a good mental is really, the thing that will help you procrastinate less, that will help you focus better, that will help you produce better work done in less time. So with that extra time, just live your life, have your social life, exercise, do all the things that humans do, all right? Just because you're a university student doesn't mean you need to be deprived of, normal, healthy human activities. So live your life and enjoy it, and then you can bring that good energy back into your studying after. So those were the 3 habits that I would develop if I were going to improve the effectiveness of my studying. Study the right material, right? Be deliberate, don't get distracted, and then as a way to implement this, okay, limit your studying. Because naturally, when you limit your studying, you're going to study more effectively. So that's it, and I hope this video can help you, save some time in your studies. Study the right things, study with the right intensity to produce better work in less time, and then spend the rest of the time just having a healthy university experience.